Hello and welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast, where we gather workplace learning insights from experts to enable the L&D community go beyond the traditional. I am Amit Garg, host of this podcast and the founder and CEO of Upside Learning Solutions. This is episode number 17, and today we have a very special guest with us, Rance Greene, the author of the book Instructional Story Design. This book is a practical guide for developing stories that train. Rance has formed needastory.com and School of Story Design for those who struggle with storytelling at work. His methodology, story design, gives leaders and talent development professionals a systematic and creative way for discovering who their audience is and how to persuade them to take action on new ideas. Rance, very welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Amit. It's great to be here.
My pleasure. I read your book recently. Here it is, just for today. And I really liked it. So before we get into the podcast, would you like to share a little bit of backstory to the book itself?
Sure. I remember going to an ATD, an Association of Talent Development chapter meeting here in Dallas, which is where I am. And I was asked to present and to show what I was doing at the company that I was working at the time. And so we had taken compliance training and brought stories center stage in that training. And I was standing out the door thinking, man, a little bit nervous, because I had only recently been starting to share my method of storytelling with other people. And I think at the time I thought everybody was doing it. But edging into out of my company and into just the general talent development field, I came to realize, oh my goodness, like nobody's doing this or very few people are doing it. And so I presented at that meeting, and it was packed out. And the questions that started coming afterward, I mean, there was a hunger for people to know how to develop stories for training. And I got bombarded at the end. It's like, how do you do this? I'm like, yeah, well, you just, you write the story and then you train using the story. And they're like, yeah, we don't know how to do that. So I was like, okay. So that kind of spurred an idea to offer a workshop for people who wanted to be better at creating stories for training. So that workshop kind of grew, it blossomed, people started doing it, corporations started using it. And I was like, oh my goodness, like the principles are so simple. They're not always easy, but they are simple. And after a while, it became clear that there was a pretty large desire among talent development professionals to adopt this. So I approached ATD and I said, hey, would you guys be interested in a book about I call it instructional story design. I call it story design. What do you guys think? And they were very interested. And so that began a relationship with ATD Press. And the book was based out of all of these workshops that I had done and the success of story design among all the folks who had attended, and the easy adoption of it after people had attended the workshop. So I wanted to make story design accessible to like our entire industry. So that's why I wrote the book. I felt like it was something like my little contribution to the talent development field. And that's how it kind of came to be.
Excellent. And which year was that when you gave the first session at ATD?
Oh my goodness. You would ask me that. 2015, maybe 2014, 15, somewhere around there.
All right. No, I think it's turned out to be a great effort, and I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people adopt, story design and bring it into workplace learning. Excellent. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
And I know when you say, the principles are simple but not easy, and I think that's where the sweet spot is really for people to learn and start applying. And hopefully,
Mhm.
we'll touch on some of that. But let's get started with trying to define stories in workplace learning context, because people will have different views of stories and perception of stories. Some of them may be looking at what they learned as children and what their children do now, etc. So there may be a little bit of misconception, maybe a little bit of confusion on what to call a story. So how would you define stories? And also, if I can plug in, why do you think they work really well?
Let's start with why do stories work so well? So, Amit, in your opinion, why do you think stories work so well? What is it about a story that like makes it so great?
I think the number one reason is relatedness, and you can generate some sort of empathy there. You can visualize you being in that situation, and that's probably the core of it. The rest of it probably is dependent on how well it is crafted, how relevant it is, especially in the workplace context. If
Yeah,
it can really transfer to the job, etc. But yeah, the initial attraction, I'm sure, is because of the relatedness.
yeah. And I think that what you're describing there is the capability of a story to act like a flight simulator where we are kind of like put in that situation, like you said, and it kind of prepares us to take action. It prepares us for action in the real world because the neurons that are firing in our brains as we're listening to a story are the same ones that need to be firing in real life, and so those patterns are being mapped out, and then it prepares us to take action. I think another reason why stories work so well is because they're so memorable. Like we remember them forever, right? I mean, if it's even halfway well told, we'll remember that story for a long time. And so that brings up the point. If we want to make our training actionable, if we want to make our training memorable, then tell a story. You know, and I think that the last kind of the thing that kind of ties all that together is that stories are a great vehicle for delivering emotion. And we know that emotion is necessary. Some sort of emotional input is necessary for us to make decisions and for us to integrate and assimilate new information. So it behooves us as talent development professionals to speak the language of stories well. So what is story? What is a story? So when you think about a story, Amit, like what are those elements of a story what are the elements that make a story a story? What's in there,
So,
in your opinion?
yeah. So typically, you would have some sort of a protagonist trying to solve a situation and hopefully coming out, a victorious person in the end through some
Yeah,
challenges and difficulties and all of those things. So, typically that would be the crux of the story. That's how
yeah,
I
yeah,
would put it.
yeah. You've covered all of it. You've covered it all. Awesome. So the purpose of story design, and I'm gonna, for those of who are watching the video, you can see this, but for those of you who are listening on the podcast, I'll describe it. So at the top of the page is story. At the bottom of the page is action. The action that we want people to take as a result of training. And what we need to do is connect our story concretely to the action that we want people to take. But there's a big gap in the middle. So we need to fill it in. So Amit, you identified some good things that are part of a story that make a story a story. There are two that are essential, and without them, you cannot have a story for training. And they are relatable characters and strong conflict. relatable characters and strong conflict. And you already know all this because you read the book, but relatable characters and strong conflict are the two elements that must be there. And so relatable characters, I say relatable characters because the audience needs to have some empathy with those characters. And like you were mentioning before. And then I say strong conflict because to emphasize the point that we do need conflict in our stories for training, and that it needs to be as strong as possible. The stronger that conflict is, the more emotional connection we'll have with that story, the more memorable it'll be, the more actionable it will be. So those are the two elements of a story: relatable characters and strong conflict, which produce this wonderful thing in the learner: a desire for resolution. And so the gap between the story at the top of the page and the action is beginning to fill up. If you think about desire for resolution, like if you see a story unfolding before your eyes, or you're listening to one, and it's got relatable characters that you care about, and it's got strong conflict, it's going to naturally produce within you this desire for resolution. And that's where we all want to be when we're listening to a story. We don't want to be bored. We want to have that desire for resolution, right? And so that's where we want the learners to be. And really, that's where they want to be too. But we still have this gap between the desire for resolution and the final action that we need people to take. And that is where our instruction comes in. And so the instruction kind of serves as the resolution, if you will, to the story itself. So that concretely connects the story to the action. And so the real stories are so concrete, right? They're real people, real world, struggling with real problems. And that's the kind of story we're talking about. These are stories that will help us communicate efficiently and give learners the opportunity to think critically about that story and figure things out. And that's when the instruction comes in, and we give them activities based on the story.
Excellent. Excellent. And of course, I did see that model, the story design model in your book, but I love the way you shared it with the audience today. I'm sure it's so much more easier for them to understand as they see the visuals and you talk through that. So thank you for sharing that. You know. So, one of the things that when I went through the book and I thought of this model and I was, thinking about, can people go a little too far in having the context and a lot of things about the characters and miss out on the instruction bit, or the story is just too thin and it doesn't really attract people. So is there a way they can draw a balance that story is there, which does its job, and the instruction is equally important in that whole output that they produce?
Yeah. Okay, great. And that's a very common question that I receive. And then my first answer is there's no overdoing a story. If it's
Okay.
designed well.
Okay.
And so if stories usually fall flat or don't have the intended impact if, number one, those characters are not relatable and we just don't care about them. So if you remove that part of the equation out, then it doesn't matter how strong that conflict is, we're just not going to care.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I don't know that person, I don't care about that person. This isn't a story for me. The second downfall is that you could leave out the strong conflict, and that's probably the most common. Is that especially as instructional designers or talent development professionals, trainers, like we just want to like present this smooth experience, right? Where there's no friction. We want to tell you how to do it. Yeah, make it easy. Do it the right way. Don't make mistakes. But the thing is, we like learn the best when we make mistakes, and we learn the best also when there is some friction there, when there is some conflict. So if you remove the conflict out of the story, you don't really have a story. You just have people doing good things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not memorable. That's not, actionable. It's like, oh, okay, you just show me the right way to do it. And there is a place for that. But I would say that kind of demonstration comes after comes within the activities after the story has taken place. So the story sets up the conflict. The activities that follow, and this is kind of a flow that I recommend, and it's also in the book, is that you tell your story first, then you ask a reflection question, especially reflecting on the emotional content. Like, how do you think this character feels, after what you've just seen? And they'll be able to tell you because they've just felt it themselves, right? They feel that tension, they feel that conflict. And then you can ask a simple question like, what do you think the problem is? And then after that, give them some real hard decisions to make. What should they do instead? Maybe it's a multiple choice. You have these, all the answers are plausible, all the answers are possible, but then in the feedback, that is where the story, maybe the right way of doing things, really belongs, after they've done the critical thinking, not before.
Yeah, it's more like test and tell. Of course, you're using a lot of emotional element here, and I really love that part where you say, people need to reflect on the emotional part, because then they are essentially reflecting on their own emotions. And the more you are reflecting on the emotional part, maybe there's a higher possibility of that sticking with you because you've gone through that, and that may not change. So brilliant. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a great point. That's a really great point. Yeah.
So, you talked of two main parts, of course, the relatable characters and a strong conflict. And I don't know if there are other challenges that people face in implementing the model, but when I was reflecting on the model itself, I was thinking creating these relatable characters could be a bit of a challenge for a lot of teams. They may not have, access to the average learner, or if it's a large population, they may not be able to really, come up with the attributes. I think you define about 8 attributes in the book. So is it something that people find ways to do soon enough after they've tried it a few times, or is it okay to just do maybe 3 or 4 of them, which are very important, and the rest may not be done always if it is too difficult?
Okay. Yeah. I think what you're expressing is kind of like instructional design. The discover phase or the analysis phase in instructional design is really the most difficult for a lot of people because it's all that just for me it's kind of the fun part, because I get to really establish a relationship with stakeholders and subject matter experts and really draw out of them what I need to know to make this instruction really sing. But story design is not a separate process from instructional design. It's simply taking the information you've gathered from the instructional design process and creating a story that will take center stage in your training. So as a designer now, you're gathering information about your audience. And maybe what you're gathering, maybe what instructional designers are gathering is something that is maybe like, well, what do they know now? So they know where to start with their design. All I'm saying is you need to know a little bit more than just what they know. You need to know who they are as people. And that's going to enhance your instruction, but it's definitely going to give you what you need for creating relatable characters. So if I had to narrow it down to 4 things, Amit, okay, 4 things. What are their current circumstances at work? That's going to help you capture a big swath of audience. So if you have a big audience and they're all undergoing an organizational change, if they're all being, if it's a call center and they've got kind of like these metrics that they've got to meet every day, that's the current circumstance. How are they reacting to those circumstances? So how are people reacting to this organizational change? Are they kind of fearing for their jobs right now? How are they reacting in the call center? Are they like stressed out because they're not, maybe they're not meeting their metrics as they should? And acknowledging, like, as a designer that's training you to do something, I know where you are. I know how you're reacting to these things. And I'm going to design a character that really reflects who you are, to respect you. So those are the first two.
Yeah.
What are their current circumstances? How are they reacting to them? The third one is, what do they fear? What do they fear? And this can definitely be brought into the story. So, what are they scared that they might disappoint a customer? Are they scared that they might, lose a customer, that they might lose their own employment, that they might get demoted? What are their real viable fears as a group? And then lastly, how will this training benefit them personally? As you, as an individual, how this training is going to benefit you personally.
Yeah.
If you can answer those four things, then you've got a pretty good grasp of who your audience is, and you can probably create a character that's fairly relatable. So the audience profile is something that I strongly recommend. Some people may not do that. I encourage you to do it. I don't think it's that difficult. It just takes a little bit of time of reflection. If you don't know who they are, go to the manager of that area. I've even I was training a group of board members,
Okay.
who were fairly well known in their fields, and so I just Googled them,
Yeah.
and I created my audience profile from that. Also, creating an action list, surprisingly, I have found that has also been difficult for some people. Even instructional designers who've been doing this a long time, where that action list is the list of actions that you want people to take as a result of training. You may call it a task list or learning objectives. But what I find is that many times the things that find themselves on that action list are not observable actions. And we can't really train on non-observable actions, right? Like, understand this or be aware of that. Those things need to get taken off the list, and we need to know what people should do when they are aware of something, what they should do when they do understand something. And so I think that also another challenge is that action list. And so when you have a very solid action list and a robust audience profile, you've got the raw materials that you need to create the story. So I would say that you're right, that the discover phase is probably the most difficult.
And if I were to just go back and see the comment that you were making about, it is not different from instructional design. Uh, I think the challenge a lot of instructional designers, learning designers probably face is the position they hold in an organization. So when it's nothing to point out a specific set of audience, but a lot of people may be just taking orders and delivering e-learning, which is not serving its real purpose. And in that situation, doing the discovery phase may not be very easy for them. And so you're right, they may not be able to do it for the instructional design programs, and they may not be able to do it for any story design either, because they are kind of overlapping. But yeah, I think it is about learning those consulting skills and
Yeah.
improving your standing, position, voice in the organization, whichever way you want to present it,
Yeah.
if you have to do this part well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Amit. And that really is what it is. It's consulting skills. And I think that as instructional designers, maybe in a large organization where you don't have access to even the stakeholder or the subject matter experts, you need to have a relationship with the people who do.
Yeah.
And influence them, tell them, I need the answers to these questions, and just establish rapport with those who are maybe a learning partner, or somebody who is face to face with those stakeholders and subject matter experts. And then create that action list, present it to whomever you present stuff to. Your learning partner, say, hey, give this to the stakeholder, ask them if this action list is accurate, and tell them to give it back to me.
Absolutely. And I like the idea of action list. In fact, from the book, for me, the number one takeaway was the action list. Because I think you also talk about it in the book somewhere about the language that the stakeholders talk. They don't talk learning objectives. An
Right.
action list is something that they can be more concerned about. You're talking about how to improve the performance of their people. So action list is a great uh, tool. If we can get to a good action list, I think a lot of it can get sorted more easily.
I agree, Amit. Yeah, the action list is just one of those many attempts I try to make to strip out any kind of jargon that folks who aren't in our industry wouldn't understand. So,
No, I love it. I think action list is the best way, and you know it incorporates the word action, which is synonymous of performance, actual tasks. So it is so much more than just a phrase that you are using there. Instead of learning objectives. So I think it brings the focus during your consulting phase to come to the points that your manager or stakeholders have to say, I want my people to be doing these things. Like you said,
yes,
not understanding these things, but doing these things. So it just, I think underlines a very important aspect of overall learning design.
you've got it. You've absolutely got it.
Fantastic, Rance. All right. So you talk about three types of stories, fiction, non-fiction, and metaphor. Uh, which one is very difficult or the most difficult to create, if I can say? Of course, not for you, but for people who are beginning to, do some story design and bring it into their training solutions.
Yeah, so the design phase is the actual design of the story. And you have some story types to pick from. You have fictional stories. Um, it's funny because people get uptight when you talk about fiction because they're like, that's not real. People won't believe it. They won't take it seriously. And I'm like, come on now. You take it seriously all the time when you watch a television show or go to a movie. We easily suspend our disbelief
Yeah.
and take a story seriously. It's really funny. I was actually helping a group of librarians through the story design process, and of any group, they had the biggest problem with fiction. And I'm like, you're librarians. You like oh, I couldn't believe it. So fiction is great because you can make the character, you can mold the character to be what you want them to be,
Yeah.
to fit the audience that you want to have. So I would say fiction is probably one of the easiest, but
Mhm.
maybe as a mental barrier, you just have to get over the fact that you're writing something that is based in reality,
Mhm.
but these aren't real people, and this isn't an actual event that maybe happened, on the job, but you're tailoring it for your audience, for training. And you don't have to feel bad about writing fiction. It's okay. They will not say, oh, this is fiction, I'm not going to take this training. No, they're going to love it. Nonfiction also presents some challenges because when you take a case study from work, you're like, I'm going to tell this case study because this case study actually says exactly what we need to say in the training. Well, a lot of times, so I worked, a lot of times you have to de-identify a case study. Like you can't tell the name of the actual person. That's obvious. But then like privacy department gets involved, legal gets involved. They're like, you can't tell that, you can't tell this, you can't tell that. Suddenly your de-identified story has no conflict, has no relatable character, like it's all been stripped out, right? So what I have often done in those kinds of situations is that I will use the case study as I'll actually present the case study de-identified as it is in some cases, more as a communication
Mhm.
outside of the training, but I'll create a parallel story that is fictional that
Mhm.
has all of the relatableness and the conflict that that the story needs.
Yeah.
So it doesn't lose its punch anymore. And then metaphors, although I find people use metaphors a lot, especially leaders. When I do leadership storytelling for leaders, they love metaphors. Um, the trick to metaphors is that you have to have very strong equivalence.
Mm.
So I'll give you an example. There was a group, and I think this even might be in the book. There was a group that came to me and said, "Hey, we need to train everybody in the company on competitive intelligence." And I said, "Are you sure? Like, you don't just want to train the salespeople or the marketing people on this?" They're like, "No, the entire organization needs to know competitive intelligence." I said, "The
Mm.
entire organization doesn't even know what competitive intelligence is." Um, so we're going to have to use something they're familiar with to explain this unfamiliar concept. So they kept using words like game and competition and playing by the rules. I'm like, what you're describing here does sound like a game. It sounds like maybe like a football game,
Mm.
American football game. So we created a story about an American football team, two American football teams, and the coach of the team, and that team was losing. Then all of a sudden, in mid-season, the team started to win. And they started to win because the coach knew something about the teams that they were competing against before they even went into the game. So what he knew was competitive intelligence. And so the coach in this case is the equivalent of the salesperson or the employee. The information that he's getting about the other teams is equivalent to the information that we might get about other companies. And then the other team was our competition. So those strong equivalents need to be intact, or else the metaphor starts falling apart. So the more strong equivalents you have in your metaphor, then the stronger that story is going to be.
Mm. But you don't find it particularly challenging to create any one of them. So is it the non-fiction one which normally faces the most resistance then?
The most resistance, but I would say is probably for most people the most accessible,
Mm.
because they're able to mold it. Nonfiction, the story is already there.
Yeah.
They just have to make sure that they all three follow the same pattern of relatable characters plus strong conflict equals desire for resolution. So the nonfiction, the story's there. They just have to bring out the relatableness of the character, and they have to make that conflict as strong as it really was in real life, and kind of show all the consequences of their actions. The metaphor is probably the hardest because of all of you have a lot of things to think about, not just the story itself, but does the story match what I'm training on?
So you kind of thinking in parallel worlds, So you
Yes,
have one which is a real one and slightly hypothetical, and you have to ensure those equivalents are available and the transfer will happen, whatever
that's
you are
right.
experiencing in the hypothetical one. Hmm.
Yes, yes.
Excellent. In fact, I think you've used a kind of a fictional story throughout your book, which is very interesting. Dana's story, and then an assignment story. So I think I love that structure where there is the main message that you are delivering, and then there is a parallel story, and then there's a parallel assignment story also running. I think it works very
Thank you, Amit. I'm so glad that you appreciate that. And I bet, thank you. I'm glad you appreciate that. And I'm glad that you didn't say, "Hey, this Dana is not a real person. I'm not going to read this book." It is fictional. It is fictional.
oh, when you were saying that, I was recalling that in year 1996, I went to a movie theater to watch Toy Story.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't so inclined to go and watch an animation movie. It was probably one of the earliest big budget animation movie in theaters. But when I came out, I was surprised at the amount of emotional connect we had with the characters. So it was kind of, an insight into myself, and I'm sure other people had into themselves. But yeah, I think, till that time, maybe we hadn't realized, because we would have thought all of these fictional cartoon characters are for kids. But
Yeah.
Toy Story was the movie that changed it for me.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I think that animation is, a super way and a really accessible way to create those stories. So that's a good point.
Excellent. So, after reading your book, I had posted something on LinkedIn talking about, stories work so well. I mean, you can use them in micro learning, in gamification, in scenario based learning. You can use them to generate interest for practice. So many things, in even ILTs and VILTs and all the areas. Still, stories don't get used so often in workplace learning. Uh, we've possibly discussed a few challenges already, but are there specific challenges, and how do we overcome them if we have to use more stories in
Yeah.
workplace learning?
Yeah. I agree. I agree with you. I think a few reasons. One of the reasons goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is why stories work so well. And one of those reasons is that stories are a great vehicle for emotional input. And if you think about corporations in general, and you think about emotions, the two don't usually go together in the same sentence. There's a bit of an emotional aversion
Mm.
within corporate settings where we like to focus maybe more on information and data and facts and figures. But the truth is, we cannot make decisions with only information, with only facts, with only facts and figures. We have to have emotional input to make the best decisions. So the fact that we are somewhat emotional averse is one of the reasons why stories, I think, are not as welcomed in corporate settings. But I also see that door opening a crack, and that people are starting to realize emotion does have a place. It doesn't mean that we all have to be crying in our meetings. It just means that there has to be some people connection. And stories are a great vehicle for doing that. I think there's probably two other reasons. One is vulnerability. Whenever you tell a story, even if it's a benign, simple story about, what happened to me this week, there there's a level of vulnerability that you have to be comfortable with to tell that story. And certainly if you're publishing a story in an e-learning course or you're broadcasting it over a virtual meeting, that takes a level of courage that maybe a lot of people just don't have. And so the story never gets told. So just cultivating that vulnerability by taking some simple steps and just trying it um, will help to overcome that lack of courage. And then the last thing I would say, Amit, is probably just process. People don't have a process for telling that story, and story design is that tool that can be used to take what you already have and craft a very strong story to deliver to your audience, whether you are an instructional designer who is crafting training, or you are a leader who is trying to communicate to your team or to your customers, or you're a small business owner trying to market your product. Story design works. It gives you the process that you need. And we work with all of those people groups, those um, those people in business. But for the instructional designers who are probably the primary people in your audience, yes, it is a little bit scary if you've never done it before, but story design provides that process for you. That's just a step by step. First, you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And it brings you to the brink of creativity, where by the time you get there, it's like the story is already forming in your head. So you don't have to make a huge leap, and you don't have this blank canvas that you're working from. You actually have a lot of things mapped out. You have a setting already in place. You have, the things in place. And then the creative part, the story creation part, a lot of it is already done for you in the process itself. So I think those things, emotional aversion, um, lack of vulnerability, and then lack of process can be used to take what you already have and craft a very strong story to deliver to your audience, whether you are an instructional designer who is crafting training, or you are a leader who is trying to communicate to your team or to your customers, or you're a small business owner trying to market your product. Story design works. It gives you the process that you need. And we work with all of those those people groups, those people in business. But for the instructional designers who are probably the primary people in your audience, yes, it is a little bit scary if you've never done it before, but story design provides that process for you. That's just a step by step. First, you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And it brings you to the brink of creativity, where by the time you get there, it's like the story is already forming in your head. So you don't have to make a huge leap, and you don't have this blank canvas that you're working from. You actually have a lot of things mapped out. You have a setting already in place. You have, the things in place. And then the creative part, the story creation part, a lot of it is already done for you in the process itself. So I think those things, emotional aversion, lack of vulnerability, and then lack of process.
When I reflect on the process part, Rance, would it be easier for instructional designers to begin with fiction stories? Because maybe they don't have to really. So metaphor stories could be a little bit of a additional work. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Non-fiction, it needs a lot of approvals, maybe shot down a little quicker. Fictional stories, which obviously rely on some real instances and things, and still has relatable characters, maybe the best bet to get started.
Yes, I usually do start with fictional. And that when I do my workshops, it's almost always fictional, because that's just a great place to start. But you're giving me some ideas, because I conduct a roundtable twice a year, and I have a different topic for each roundtable. And these are free meetings of people who have read the book, or who are practicing instructional story design and just want to get together and commiserate or share their successes. The next one's on script writing, but I think that you've made a good point that maybe I need to have a roundtable on metaphors and a roundtable on case studies, like how to write good metaphors and how to write good case studies. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. You figured so many ideas. I haven't even compiled all of them yet. There's so many markings in the book yet, which I have to go back to. Wonderful, wonderful. All right. So, Rance, if you have an example story or a case study, you may have a full story or not, or just a little bit of it, which really made business impact. If you can share maybe one of them.
Sure. I mean, there are I've heard back from so many people who've implemented it, who have like hard numbers, that go behind the storytelling. And I've even done some experimentation of my own when I worked in a company to kind of like isolate the story part of the training just to test it out to see how effective it was. But I'll share one. I love sharing this one. It's actually in the book, but I love it so much because it really captures, I think, what we all feel when we hear a story, and we kind of all know intuitively. But I was asked to design a course for a group within a company that was experiencing a lot of compliant ethics and compliance issues. We were getting a lot of complaints from that area, and the managers were like, "Hey, we need you to come in," and basically like slap their hand, tell them not to do that. And we're like, eh. So we designed a story. And the story was about these 4 employees at a coffee shop. And each of the coffee shop employees were had these personalities. So the manager or the owner of the coffee shop, right? And then there was the barista of the coffee shop, and his thing was like quality, quality, quality. We have to have a quality product. He was so proud of the quality of the coffees, of the coffee beans. Then you had Marlon, who is kind of like the do-it-all guy. He can do anything in the coffee shop because he's been there forever. And then you have Kate, and Kate is brand new, and she has all these innovative ideas about how they can increase production, and she is responsible for roasting the beans. And so, conflict starts to happen when, Kate's roasting production is increasing, but the quality is kind of going down a little bit. And then some words are exchanged between them. And all this time, the manager or the owner of the coffee shop is completely unaware that any of this is going on. So at the end of the story, which we made it into this video that people could watch out of stick figures. This was very early on. And so what we did is we assigned each table a character to kind of watch during the story. And then at the end, we asked, you need to answer this question on behalf of your character. Is there a problem at the coffee shop? And so the people that were at the owner's table were like, no, there's no problem. And the people at the Kate table were like, nope, I don't see any problem here. But the other two were like, yeah, there's some problems here. And so then we were asking, what are those problems? And then we asked each table, okay, how would you solve this problem? How would your character contribute to solving this problem? And so you can see what's happening now, right? Each person is into their own character's head. They're seeing this story from a different perspective. So there are managers in the room who are not at the manager table, who are not at the owner's table. There are people who are not managers who are at the owner's table. So they're seeing things from a very different point of view. And so all of the issues that were in the workplace were actually being played out in this fictional metaphor of a story in the coffee shop. Right. We were not training coffee shop workers. We were training corporate workers. But something wonderful happened in that they took ownership then. And they were providing suggestions for how this team could work better as a group. And really, they were providing suggestions for themselves. And then about 9 months later, we get a call from the managers from that area, and they're like, thank you so much for coming. They're like, things have changed. Our attitude around there is so our productivity is up. Everything is like is falling in line. And whenever we see one another kind of like creeping back into old habits, we tell each other, remember the coffee shop. Because the story of the coffee shop contained everything that was needed for behavior change. They didn't say, hey, remember that cool bullet list number 7 on that. You shouldn't do that. No. All they needed was to remember the story, and boom, they're like, oh yeah, I shouldn't be doing this, or oh yeah, I need to be doing this instead. Why? Because they said, remember the coffee shop. I mean, that's an amazing testimonial to the power of a well-crafted story for training.
That's a wonderful case study. And while you were talking about, I was also thinking, is there a element of uh, non-personalization that is there in such stories, where people are able to think, by stepping away and almost taking a independent view without their own emotions that they would face in a similar situation in their company, and hence the suggestions they are making or whatever they are thinking as the right solutions are actually much better than what they would do possibly in a group discussion to solve a similar problem internally.
Amit, you are spot on. That is so right. And I think that, and especially in sensitive topics like ethical behavior, things like that. And it gives you that distance. And I think we wanted to give them even more distance, which is why we took it even outside of the workplace and made it a metaphor and put it in a coffee shop to give it even more distance. It didn't decrease the effectiveness of the training by removing it from the workplace. It actually, like you said, it gave them this extra distance to be able to objectively give suggestions that would be maybe better than they were having a focus group or something like that.
Excellent.
That's very astute.
Excellent. And also what you talked about, they kind of reminding each other, remember the coffee shop. It's like popular slangs inside an organization. So there is a common vocabulary that gets developed if a story-based program or any program that can have those catchphrases or things that can be carried into the work, which helps each other. People do nudge each other and say, hey, that is what we were trying to do. Maybe we can do this. So it looks like that this one really caught on.
Yes. And you're hitting on something that's incredibly powerful, because you're talking about culture, really. It's got integrated into the culture of that team. And what we found, this particular company that I worked for, it was an ethics and compliance function that I was in, and I was, overseeing the training for the entire organization. That the culture that we instilled in the employees that worked there came from our stories. And everybody knew the characters. Everybody knew the sayings that these characters would say, and it became so infectious that by the time those culture surveys came around, every year, ethics and compliance, number one every single year after we started incorporating stories into the training and into our communications. So stories can have a major impact on the culture of a company.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's a wonderful story. Of course, I read some of it, of course, in the book, but then what you added today has been very insightful. I think this has been a fantastic conversation, Rance, one that I was wanting to have for a long time. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing so many wonderful insights about story design. I think it was lovely. Lovely.
Thank you so much, Amit. I really appreciate you inviting me.
My pleasure. Thank you.